Amy, for people to,
Just
can people hear us already?
they can hear you.
Okay, so Meha, do you want to start?
Sure. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. We're hoping that this will be a really interactive discussion. My name is Meha Jain. I'm an assistant professor in the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. And broadly, my research examines how environmental change, including climate change, is affecting agricultural production and how farmers may be able to adapt to reduce negative impacts. And I also look at how we might be able to increase agricultural production sustainably over the coming decades.
Hi, everyone. I also want to welcome you to this webinar on hunger and the Sustainable Development Goal of Zero Hunger by 2030. My name is Arun Agrawal. I'm a faculty member at the University of Michigan in the same school as Meha is. And I'm very happy to be a part of this webinar. I'm especially happy that Meha is running the show because she is a real star, and I'm looking forward just as much as you are to what happens in this webinar and to learn from what she's going to say. So welcome again, and thank you very much for joining us.
Great. So I thought what I would do is I'll just give a very short, 3 to 4 minute PowerPoint just to open up, what we're sort of thinking about and what the current issues are related to zero hunger and meeting this goal of zero hunger. And then we could open it up to question and answer. So let me just very quickly share my screen. Oh.
Okay.
Sorry. Could you guys hear that? Or
I can see it.
You can see it?
Yeah, no, I cannot see it now.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Arun, could you hear my voice going with that as well, or no?
I can hear your voice now, but there's a little bit of a jump at some point.
Let's see. All right. All right. So today we're going to talk about Sustainable Development Goal 2, Zero Hunger. Why is this goal important? Well, after decades of improvements, the world has seen an increase in the number of people who suffer from hunger starting in 2015. About 9% of the world's population is hungry. What does it mean to be hungry? Well, the FAO, or the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, defines hunger as an uncomfortable or painful... Oh, can you not see the PowerPoint?
I cannot see the PowerPoint.
You can't, sorry.
Something is
All
going
right.
on.
I'm not sure what's going on. Let me try again. Sorry, everyone.
Maybe I'm going to make you, can I make you the host? Maybe that'll help.
All right. Is this working now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So the FAO defines hunger as an uncomfortable or painful sensation caused by insufficient food energy consumption. Levels of hunger are expected to increase as the world's population grows by an additional 2 billion people by 2050. But what if I told you that we actually already produce enough food to feed 10 billion people? This is a graph showing overall food production in terms of kilocalories per person from 1961 to the present. So you can see that we're already producing over 2,500 kilocalories per person, which is more than enough for an individual's needs. So if we have enough food, why is 9% of the world's population still hungry? And what can we do to ensure meeting the targets of SDG 2 by 2030? So these are some questions that we hope to explore in today's webinar and also in the class that I teach under the Master's Track Certificate Program. So one of the challenges is that even though we produce enough food to feed 10 billion people, a large amount of this food is actually lost or wasted. So food that's lost or wasted is basically any food that's produced or harvested for human consumption, but that is ultimately not eaten. So how much of the world's food is lost or wasted it varies based on how it's measured. So considering calories, about 25% of the world's food is wasted, and considering mass of food, about 33% of the world's food is lost or wasted. So you can see that these are really, really large numbers, and this plays a very significant role in why we're not able to make sure that everyone has enough food moving forward. So just to very quickly give an overview of where most of this lost and waste is happening so that we can start to open the discussion of how we can solve these problems. This is a graph showing the different stages of food production. I'm not going to go into the details right now of what each of these are, but I just want to highlight basically that the size of these bars represents the percent or the amount of food that's lost or wasted at each of these stages. And you can see that this biggest bar occurs here at the stage of consumption. So what this graph is showing is that 35% of all of the world's food that's lost or wasted occurs at this stage of consumption. And that means that that's food that's lost or wasted when it actually already arrives at the level of the consumer. So this is food that you may have purchased from the grocery store, food that you may have gotten at a restaurant or a cafeteria to eat, but it's food that's purchased but not eaten for some reason, either because it spoils before it can be eaten, or it's because people are throwing away leftovers or not eating food that they have cooked. So this is really a big entry point in trying to figure out ways to reduce food loss and food waste. Another way that we might be able to increase food production and make sure that we meet the goals of zero hunger by 2030 is to actually increase the levels of production even further, even though we already produce enough food to feed 10 billion people. So this is just a graph that shows levels of food production increase from 1960s to the present. And you can see that the amount of production, and particularly yields of cereal crops, has greatly increased over the last 60 years. And a lot of experts estimate that if we are going to increase food moving forward, we're going to need to do it by further increasing yields and further intensifying our agricultural lands by targeting areas that are currently low yielding. So this is a map that was produced by a study published in 2012 by Mueller et al., where they're showing basically areas where yields are currently lower than expected or lower than what they could be under ideal management scenarios. And those low yielding areas are highlighted in the warm colors in red and yellow. So what a lot of experts argue is that we need to target these areas with new interventions, new techniques, new farming practices, and find ways to actually bring up their level of production to those that we could expect moving forward. So that's all that I have, and I'd like to open it up for question and answer for anything that people want to ask. Thanks.
I just wanted to also add that we are doing this webinar in the context of the master's track certificate online curriculum on sustainability and development that we have launched. And the MTC aims to focus in particular on those of the SDGs that we found to be either the most important ones or the ones that are most directly connected with questions of sustainability. So a lot of what Meha is talking about today and what we will be discussing today is also represented in the work that we are doing with the online curriculum as well. And if, in terms of asking questions, you can either pose the question in the chat, or you can put it in the question and answer, and then I'll be able to moderate the questions and either answer them myself, or as would happen in most instances, ask Meha if she can address them. Thank you so much.
Great. So it looks like a bunch of questions are coming in.
Yeah,
Arun,
there are a bunch of questions. So Meha, what I can do is just sort of go through the questions and ask them to you if you want to focus on the webinar itself, or you can look through the questions and decide which ones you would like to answer. How would you like to proceed?
Doesn't matter. Why don't you go ahead and pose the questions? That sounds great.
Okay, so there's one really interesting question about how we are producing a lot of food, but are we producing enough nutritious food? And how does the nutritional value of crops get affected by the increasing industrialization of agriculture and other aspects of commercial agriculture, such as concentration of a few food suppliers and so forth?
Yes, that's a really great and big question. So one thing that I want to say is a lot of times when people are talking about hunger, they'll often talk about this in terms of calories. So are people getting enough calorie requirements? But as you point out, that's not the only thing that we care about. We also care about nutritional quality. And there's a lot of research showing that, in fact, even if a large proportion of the world is getting enough calories, we're actually not getting the right nutrients. So studies have shown, there's actually this really great report that came out called the Eat Lancet report. I really recommend anyone reading that who's interested in these topics. And what these reports have shown is that even though a large proportion of the world might be getting enough calories, they're not getting enough nutrition in terms of eating whole grains, fruits, nuts, vegetables, and seafood, which have been shown to actually really improve health. So I think this is a really important point and something that we really need to consider when we're discussing food security. It's not just about calories and meeting calorie goals. It is also about nutrition.
Yeah, I think there was a similar question that I think you've also answered about the presence and availability of micronutrients in terms of food security. Second question that somebody had, which is also very interesting, is how do we calculate food waste at the consumer level? It seems like it is easier to do so in other parts of the food supply chain, but how do people do so looking at what consumers are doing and how much food might be wasted at the table or after purchase from the store?
That's a really great question. So I'm not sure of the exact methodologies that are used because this is a little bit outside of my field, but I imagine a lot of this is done through surveys and sort of recall from interviewing people. It could also be by measuring waste at the municipality level. So maybe through, dumpsters at a restaurant or sort of waste produced at the household level.
Right, right. I have not been mentioning the names of people who are asking the question, so I'm sorry about that, but I do want to start doing that. And Allison has a question for you, Meha, which is that if we are already producing enough food to provide enough nutrients and calories for the entire population, does it make sense to focus on increasing the supply of food, and should we not be focusing instead on redistribution and trade and exchange of food across different spatial locations?
That's a fantastic question. So I would argue that I think we need to do both. In an ideal world, if we could fix all of the distribution, all of the waste issues, we don't need to increase food production whatsoever. We already produce enough food. But in reality, getting that waste down to 0% is very, very unlikely for a variety of reasons. So I personally believe, and I think this is what a lot of experts say, is that we're going to actually need to tackle both issues, both supply and the use and distribution of food to meet zero hunger.
Yeah. So there's a question from Henny who's asking, what is the effect of trying to increase food productivity on soil health and on the environment?
That's a really great question. So if you guys remember the one graph that I showed of big increases in yield over the last 60 years, a lot of that has come at actually the detriment to the environment. So while we were getting these large increases in yield, part of that was through increases of synthetic fertilizers, which have led to soil degradation and also eutrophication. It's been caused or produced by increasing irrigation and freshwater withdrawals. Agriculture is responsible for about 80% of the freshwater withdrawals across the world, and this is leading to rapid groundwater depletion and the loss of freshwater in many parts of the world. So what many people have now argued is that we do still need to increase yields, most likely moving forward to meet this goal of zero hunger, but we have to do this in a way that's sustainable. So a lot of people have called for, instead of just doing intensification, we need to do what's called sustainable intensification. So basically figuring out technologies and practices that can increase yield while reducing the negative impacts on the environment. And I would be happy to talk about what some techniques are if people are interested in that. Oh, Arun, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I'm sorry. This is a question from Sean Kennedy, and he's directing this question to both of us, but perhaps you can go first. And it's asking a little bit more about the research that you are doing, and can you talk a little bit more in detail about the topics that you anticipate focusing on in the next couple of years? And once you've done that, I can also answer that question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. So right now in my lab, as I mentioned, we have two broad pillars of research. One is trying to understand how farmers can adapt to environmental change like climate change. And the other pillar of research is figuring out ways that we might be able to sustainably intensify agriculture. So I'll just very quickly give you two example projects that cover those two topics. So in terms of adaptation, a lot of my work focuses in India. And right now we're trying to understand how farmers are responding both to warming temperatures, which are reducing yields of crops like wheat, but also groundwater depletion. India is the largest user of groundwater worldwide. It provides 60% of irrigation for agriculture, and it's becoming rapidly depleted. So we're trying to understand how farmers are changing their behaviors and whether they're able to adapt to these shocks. And then with the second pillar of research, we're trying to identify technologies that farmers can adopt on farm to increase yields. And we're doing this in partnership with CIMMYT, which is an international organization focused on improving wheat and maize yields across the world. And one such example of a technology is we've deployed this new fertilizer spreader backpack, because right now fertilizers are applied really inefficiently in parts of India. And we found that this low-cost technology can actually increase yields by 10 or 15% without increasing fertilizer inputs whatsoever. So this is a really great example of a sustainable intensification technology.
Actually, there's another question on that, Meha, and I know that you did recently a review of this, which asks, like, if you could say a little bit more about what are the sustainable intensification or sustainable agricultural technologies that are promising.
Yeah, so I think some of the most promising ones are basically technologies that can figure out ways to use inputs more efficiently. So as I mentioned, there's this fertilizer spreader technology. There's things like drip irrigation, where you can basically apply water directly to the plant as opposed to fully irrigating a field. I think those technologies are really promising because not only do they basically increase yields, but they also do so in a way that's often cost effective for farmers because they don't have to use as many inputs. And I think the second broad suite of technologies that's really exciting are those that really tap into ideas of agroecology and figure out ways to kind of increase yields in an environmentally sustainable way. So these could be things like zero tillage, where you actually figure out ways to prepare fields and plant seeds without having to till the soil, which can lead to a lot of soil degradation and erosion. It can be things like mulching and cover crops, where you maintain cover on the field, which once again can improve soil health and reduce erosion.
Somebody asked a question about the role of AI in in greater productivity and what you see as its future in agricultural production.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of scope for AI and just digital technologies more broadly. As an example, in my work, we actually use satellite data a lot to try to understand what areas are lower yielding that we could target with interventions. We use satellite data to measure the impact of our interventions on the ground. There are also a lot of mobile technologies that are being developed that either can serve as a platform for farmers to get more information about their specific field from, say, agricultural extension agents or agronomists. And yeah, I think this is a really big space moving forward. One caveat, though, I do want to say is there is a lot of excitement, especially around these digital technologies. But I do want to highlight that not everyone will have access to these technologies right now. There actually was a great study that just came out recently, I think in Nature Sustainability, that talked about the digital divide across farmers around the world. And I'll post a link to that study at the end of this webinar in case anyone wants to see it, to see basically who has access to these technologies and could really benefit and who doesn't.
So I was just told that my voice is coming across very low, and I will try to speak more close to my computer's microphone. I also wanted to say just a little bit about my own research. It focuses much less than Meha's does on food security and issues of food and hunger. There is one specific project that we have funded by 2 or 3 different organizations, which is focused on food security, land tenure, and land tenure change in East Africa, with a particular focus on Ethiopia. But we also look at a little bit of the a little bit at how tenure change affects food production, but also how it affects land cover and land cover change in a number of Eastern African countries. And what we are particularly interested in is understanding the relationship between changes in productivity on land, in agricultural areas, and also how that is correlated with, or how that goes together with changes in land cover and in forest cover. And what we find is it's inspired, this project was inspired by the large scale land acquisitions that are happening in many different, many poor countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also a lot in Southeast Asia, in a number of Eastern European countries, and in Latin America. And what we find is that in most cases, and this is very consistent with a lot of work on ecosystem services and on provisioning versus regulating services, what we find is that there is a significant decline in agricultural in land cover in terms of forests or in terms of pastoral areas that goes together with increases in food production and productivity on land. And there is also an increase in emissions. And the key question for us is also to then try to understand how it may be possible to maintain carbon in the soil, or to reduce the levels of emissions, even as food production and food productivity of the land are going up. So thank you very much for that question. There's a very interesting question from someone called Henny Meha, which says, how are microplastics in the ocean waters affecting nutrients and affecting the quality of seafood?
That's a great question. To be honest, it's outside of the scope of what I study. I can tell you, just based on my general reading, I think microplastics in general are going to become a bigger concern as people learn more about this moving forward. I read recently that, not to scare you, but all of us eat about 1 credit card size worth of microplastics every week, just through the water that we're drinking that we get from the tap, food that we're consuming, and also even in the air that we breathe. So I think that it is a really big problem that people will, start to pay more attention to moving forward.
Thank you, Meha. There's a question about the report you mentioned and whether we can provide a link to that. And I think somebody provided a link in chat, and it was from a publication from Lancet. Is that the one that you meant?
Yep.
If not, we can send a report. We can send a link to everyone who's registered for the webinar after the webinar is done.
Yep. So it is the one that I think was put by Gurpreet. And I also answered one question with a link to the report as well.
Okay, excellent. There's a question about from Chris Chari about how a shift to plant-based consumption might help improve food yield. So I understand that plant-based consumption can significantly increase the number of people who are able to eat food grown from the same amount of land, but I'm not sure how plant-based consumption can also improve food yield.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not sure about the yield question either, but I do completely agree that if people were to transition overall to a more plant-based diet, we would be able to meet more of the caloric demand, given that plant-based foods do require less land and less inputs to produce than animal-based foods. So actually, once again, I keep referring to this Eat Lancet report, but they actually do a really great summary discussing what the environmental and health impacts are of different food groups, and they give recommendations. So their recommendation is actually that 50% of your plate should be made up of fruits and vegetables, about 25% should be from whole grains, I think 15% from plant-based food, and only about 5 to 10% should come from animal-based foods. And this is a recommendation based on both health impacts and also environmental impacts.
Right. I think this question about food distribution being the appropriate strategy for food security, for greater food security, versus increase in food production and food supplies being the one that should be the greater focus, has come from many different participants. And I think it would be useful to dwell on that a little bit more, because if it is the case that the more critical strategy, or the strategy with the greater payoff, is to try to redistribute or try to distribute food better and improve food access, why is so much of the effort of so many different food producers, research organizations focused on increasing food production instead of trying to improve food distribution and food access?
That's a great question. So this is a big question, and I'll do my best to answer it. So I think it's two reasons. The first is that, once again, trying to get to 0% loss and waste, I think it's just not possible. So if you remember the graph that I showed of basically stages of food loss at different stages of food production, the biggest source of food loss and waste happens at the consumption level. So this is individual behavior. These are decisions people are making at the household level to, not eat leftovers, to, forget about food that they bought in the fridge and have it spoil. And, having everyone in the world kind of change their individual behavior at that level, I think is a really, really big challenge. And it's something that we can definitely target, but I think getting to the point where there's 0% household food waste is probably unrealistic. The second reason is there are also a lot of economic reasons that we have food loss and waste. So there was a great question in the chat asking how much food is actually wasted at the field level because of, say, economic reasons. And it's about 24% of food loss or wasted happens at the field scale. And that's because it might be uneconomical for a farmer to harvest a crop given a decrease in prices, for example, in a given year. That's what happened this year with COVID. I don't know if you guys read, many farmers actually had to just till really great food crops back into the soil because it just wasn't economical for them to sell it because there was just such a decrease in demand from places like restaurants and hotels. So I think that's one reason we really can't get to 0% loss of food. But I think the other reason is that increasing yields, if you remember that yield gap map that I showed, a lot of the yield gaps are happening in tropical countries, primarily consisting of smallholder farmers and smallholder systems. And in those areas, increasing yields isn't only a matter of food security, it's also a matter of household welfare because so many people rely on agriculture as their primary livelihood. So if we can find ways to increase production, especially for these smallholder systems, it's a win-win situation where we're getting, improved food production, but we're also helping incomes for some of the poorest people in the world.
Yeah, I think very related to that is another question about what you see as the role of small-scale producers in global food security. I know that the largest numbers of producers, food producers in the world, are small farmers, but in the aggregate, what is their contribution to global food security and food supply?
Great question. So that's been a hot topic in the literature over the last few years, and people have come up with a lot of different estimates. But the most recent estimate that I found is about a third of global food supply is produced by smallholder farmers. So not only are smallholder farmers, they make up a larger proportion of all farmers across the world, they also are producing a third of the global food supply. So they are really, really important for global food security.
Yeah, yeah. So Keith Klein has two questions. One of them is about who is buying the rural lands in Africa and are there reliable data on that? And the second is, what do you see as the role of urban food production in both urban and semi-urban areas, I would guess. So I can answer the first one, who's buying the rural lands in Africa? So first of all, I should say the extent of land transactions is vast. It is, some people have called it the greatest land grabs since colonialism. And so it is a very large, it is happening at a very large scale, both in terms of many of the individual transactions, which are for tens of thousands of hectares, and also in terms of the total amount of land that is being bought and sold. Having said that, I should say that very little of this land is actually bought, sold. Most of the land is acquired as on leases or on long-term or as long-term concessions. So that what people are doing is not paying the value of the land. They are providing a contribution to governments in these countries in exchange for getting control over what happens to that land for the next 25 years or 10 years or 50 years. So it's more, that's why we often call it land acquisition rather than land purchases. And then in terms of who is actually buying, which is your main question, most of the acquisitions are being done not so much, well, I shouldn't say not so much. Most of the acquisitions are being done by the richer countries and investors in what is often called the global north, but let's say higher income countries. So the two biggest acquirers of land, the two countries from which the greatest land acquisition has happened are the US and the UK. After that comes China. But some of the data on this is also not fully reliable, or I should say it is not fully reliable, it is incomplete. So that as we get more data, we see new countries or investors from new countries coming into the picture. So some of the largest land acquisitions have happened not in sub-Saharan Africa or in Southeast Asia or even Latin America, but in Ukraine and Argentina, which have not given up, but which have put close to 3 to 5% of their total land, or total agricultural land, into these new agricultural investments. So yeah, I think it's a major shift. It is being bought. A lot of it is being acquired by international investors, but we shouldn't forget the role of domestic land investors as well. So I would say probably about, in terms of the number of large-scale land transactions, maybe half of them are domestic. In terms of the aggregate area, maybe about a third of the transacted lands are being acquired by domestic investors within the country. And part of it is for getting control over food production, but part of it is also very speculative investments and the expectation that prices or acquiring costs of these lands will go up. Meha, maybe I can turn to you for the second question from Keith Klein, which is talking about the role of urban food production in food security.
Sure. So I think there is definitely a role for urban agriculture in terms of increasing food production, but I would say it's probably not going to be a main mode or a main method to increase total calories. Where I think it could really help is by increasing access. So a lot of times, once again, we have enough food, but people aren't getting enough of it, especially the most nutritious foods like vegetables. So what people have argued is that with urban farming, this could be a way for people to actually grow these food crops that are of high nutritional value and often difficult to find in local markets, to have better access at the local scale.
Yeah. Violeta is asking a question of you, Meha. She is talking about her country, El Salvador, and she's talking about how the use of land for supporting housing construction projects or protecting forests, how does this affect water availability in the future? And I know this is not a topic on which you're doing research directly, but perhaps if you can reflect on it or say something about it, that would be great.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So over the coming decades, I think water security is going to become an even bigger problem in many parts of the world. I highlighted one example in India where there's significant groundwater depletion. Violetta, this is another great example where there likely will be increasing pressures on water security. I still think that agriculture is probably the primary driver in most parts of the world. Once again, I think the statistic is something like 80% of freshwater withdrawals are happening for agriculture. But I think there will be increasing competition from multiple sectors over the coming decades. And climate change will also make this more of a problem in places that it will have less rainfall and more periods of drought.
Thank you, Meha. Here, Lewis asks a question, which is focusing on how sustainable intensification is related to biodiversity and different functional diversity traits of vegetation or of other land-based terrestrial biodiversity issues.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one hope that people have with certain sustainable intensification techniques is it will be friendlier not only to the natural resources that agriculture depends on, but also biodiversity. And in terms of functional traits, I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but people do argue that using agroecological approaches where you do have more functional trait diversity, that could be a way to increase yields by more effectively using or capturing the nutrients in the soil. So it could be an effective way to increase yields in a more sustainable way. I'm not sure if that was the question you were asking.
No, I think this is very good. Thank you very much. There's a question about the relationship between irrigation and its environmental impacts. And I think partly, and I'll just say a few words on this, Meha, hopefully not exposing my ignorance too much. But I think part of the issue is about what kind of irrigation one is talking about. So irrigation can be from groundwater, it can be from from canals or from extracting groundwater. And the type of source that one is using for irrigation would have a significant effect. It would certainly mean decline in water tables, as is happening in many parts of the world where you have intensive irrigation occurring. It can also mean salination of soils. But here I will turn to you, Meha, and say what would be your thoughts on this question about the relationship between irrigation and its environmental impacts.
Yeah, so thanks, Arun, and thanks for this question. So I completely agree. You have to consider what the source of irrigation is. So Arun highlighted some really big environmental impacts from groundwater depletion. You could similarly, if you have large uses of surface reservoirs and surface sources of irrigation, you could potentially have reduced stream flow or water quality issues potentially, which could impact biodiversity or animals trying to use that water. So some potential solutions moving forward. I know a lot of people have talked about potentially doing more sustainable irrigation like rainwater harvesting or figuring out ways to store rainfall as opposed to kind of depleting already existing sources. Or figuring out technologies like drip irrigation where you use less water in the first place.
Yeah. There's a very provocative question, Meha, from I am sure I'm going to mispronounce your name, from Sibonginkosi Mazibu, who asks, can we talk about zero hunger when multinational corporations have so much control over the seeds, which are fundamental to food production?
That's a great question. Do you want to take a stab at this, Arun?
Well, I think I will take the devil's advocate position. So maybe you will completely disagree with me. But let me just say, so yes, it is true that multinational corporations control the production and the supply of many of the high-yielding varieties of seeds, and that poses concerns about the stability of future food supplies, and over, as you said, who controls the food supply. But there are two or three other issues to keep in mind here as well. One is that simply because multinational corporations are producing high-yielding seed varieties doesn't mean that they are the only ones who can do so. At least in the case of BT cotton, for example, a lot of farmers in India used those seeds to create their own seed varieties and then to plant the seed varieties that they had created instead of relying on the supply of the cotton seeds from multinationals. But if I were to take the position or the point of view of the multinational, I might say, well, multinationals invested a lot of resources and money into creating these new seed varieties, even if some of the research might have also been supported by universities or by governments. But so shouldn't they get some return for having created these new seeds and for having improved the productivity of the output or increase the output per unit of land? And so Meha, hopefully this gives you an opening to say, no, you're completely wrong on this.
Well, I guess I maybe sort of want to turn the question a little bit and say that if we step back, having these new seed varieties is a really critical way to increase yields over the last 60 years, and it will continue to be an increasing, it'll continue to be a very important way to increase yields moving forward. So I think regardless, we can't demonize these technologies because I think that we unfortunately will need them to meet zero hunger goals moving forward. I think Arun brought up a really great point that it isn't just these large corporations that are producing these seeds. There are a lot of great nonprofit organizations and universities that are also trying to do the same. So I mentioned CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Breeding Institute. They've done a lot of really critical work that's really helped raise maize and wheat yields across the world. And I think they've done it in a way that really hasn't disadvantaged the farmer in terms of profits and their livelihood. So, I think that there are ways to potentially use these technologies moving forward that aren't so detrimental at the local scale.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question from Irina Shevchuk, which asks, what do you think about promoting small gardens, for example, on a rooftop in big cities? And just drawing from what you said earlier about urban food production, Meha, I might reply to this question from Irina by saying, yes, I think it's a great strategy for many families to produce some food for themselves. And I think one should also think about the role of urban gardens, urban home gardens, not only in terms of the contribution they make to food supplies, but also the kinds of benefits they might provide to people who are doing the gardening in terms of uh, uh, giving them a sense of efficacy in producing their own food, in terms of the enjoyment that they derive out of the gardening activities. This year, for example, uh, uh, in our family, we planted a couple of small beds of tomatoes and peppers outside our house. And at the end of the season, we probably had gotten maybe 8 tomatoes and 6 peppers, and the price of each of those in terms of just the inputs, water and compost, etc., was probably $5 per tomato. If I include our labor cost, it was probably $50 per tomato. So the reason for producing this food was not so much the purely instrumental one of how much can we contribute to our food supply, but also some some sense of satisfaction from trying to grow something. But I don't know, Meha, if you would add say something additional to this question from Irina.
Yeah, I think I'll just go back and repeat what I said for the initial question about urban farming. I personally think the biggest gains that we can get from urban farming and local gardens is access to specific food products that otherwise people may not have had access to. So fresh produce and vegetables in places where it's hard to find in the market.
Yes. Again, there's a question from Rishabh Sonkar, who asks, does a vegan diet help in mitigating the climate crisis? And would more plant-based diets and products, and would that add to overconsumption in relation to food security over the coming years? And my initial sense is that a vegan diet would help address the uh, uh, the the amount of the concerns about increasing food production and how that affects both land conversion, because typically vegan diets need less land and fewer inputs to provide the same nutrients and calories that in comparison to a meat-based diet. But Meha, how do you think it could help mitigate the climate crisis as well?
Yeah, so I completely agree with you, Arun. And this is something, once again, I'm going to highlight that Eat Lancet report. This is something that they really highlight, that if we move more towards plant-based diet, particularly plant-based proteins, this could be a way to meet nutritional needs in a way that doesn't have as much harm or impact on the environment. That being said, I do want to play kind of the devil advocate's role in this as well and give you the other side of this issue. One is, who is it for us to tell people what to eat or what to choose to eat? There have been some discussions, and if you take my class, this is actually one of the activities you'll do in the class, but there have been discussions of, should we, for example, place taxes on meats? Should we place taxes on red meat to try to incentivize people to move to a more vegan lifestyle? I don't know, do you feel ethically okay with that? So that's one, sort of issue we need to think about. And the second issue is that I think the health impacts of entirely moving to a vegan diet are also still a little bit debatable. So a lot of nutritionists have argued that even though we can get sources of iron and zinc, for example, from plants, they're actually much more easily and readily absorbed if you have them from animal-based sources. So I think that there is a little bit of debate too of, is it really a one-to-one substitution if you're moving away from animal to plant-based foods?
Yeah, yeah. There's a question from Anne, which is, how can we reduce our intake of microplastics? And I will take an initial stab at this, Meha, and then maybe you can provide your additions or your thoughts as well. I think one way we can think about about reducing microplastics in our diet at least at two levels. One is through individual action, and the second is through collective action. Individual action, I mean, you can identify which are the sources of food which have the highest amounts of plastics in them and try to reduce your consumption of those. So even, for example, with respect to seafood, uh, you can, at one level, you could say almost all seafood is contaminated, whether it is produced in farms or whether it is wild, but the nature of contaminants, the levels of contaminants differ across different sources of food. So you can think about which ones have the lowest sources and do some of your own research and try to go for those where you feel most comfortable. But the second part of this is that as long as the use of plastics and as long as plastic pollution continues unabated, there's only so much that individual action can accomplish. And while some people may be acutely conscious of this, others may be less conscious or aware of this, some people, accordingly, they can reduce their consumption at the population level. Unless we reduce the production and use of plastics, we are not going to solve the microplastics problem. And there, I think the ways in which many oil companies are moving as they see the writing on the wall and as they see the fossil fuel business potentially becoming less viable over the coming 25 to 30 years, they are moving much more aggressively into the production and distribution and increasing supply of plastics and adaptation of plastics for many different uses, including in fact for housing construction. So I think until we address that, until we address what is happening with the production of plastics, it's going to be very hard to do something effectively about the consumption of microplastics and the presence of microplastics in our diet.
Yeah, I just to echo what Arun said, I completely agree. I think there are some small adjustments that we could make on our end. For example, buying foods that aren't packaged in plastics, maybe getting a water filter that can remove microplastics. But to be honest, I really think it's such a pervasive problem that it's not something you can change too much through individual action. And it's something more that we have to push governments and companies to take care of for us.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question which maybe I will ask Amy to answer, which is, will the attendees in the webinar receive a certificate for attending the webinar? So I don't know, Amy, what your what your plans are. Maybe you or Wendy can address this question.
I am not sure. I don't know if Wendy, if you know anything. If not, I can check with Eric, who originally was in charge of scheduling this, and we can get that answer to everybody for sure. I know the webinar also was recorded, so we'll get it out to everybody and we can answer that question at the same time.
Yeah, I think, we are coming to the close of the hour, and I know that we haven't gotten through many of the questions that you posed, and I'm both very happy about it, that there is so much interest in this topic and that you are participating so actively in it. But I'm also sorry that we will not be able to answer all the questions, but we'll try to answer a couple more questions before our time with you ends today. So one of those questions is about what's the role of subsidies in the continued production of animal products and animal foods, and would it help to remove these subsidies for animal products in terms of helping move diets towards more plant-based options, or reducing emissions, or other positive impacts of reducing reliance on meat-based products?
That's a
And this
great question.
question came from Chris Chari.
That's a fantastic question, and I do think subsidies play a big role. So just to give an example, in the US is the biggest producer of corn, and I think a third of the corn in the US is used for animal feed. And as many of you maybe know, corn production is heavily subsidized in the US. So, that's one example where potentially shifting the way that subsidies are allotted could potentially change the dependence on livestock. But I think it's a much more systemic problem than just subsidies. I think that would help reduce dependence on livestock a little bit, but I think more would have to be done in terms of individual behavior and choices.
Yeah, there are two. I think we can take two more questions. So I will try to answer one of the questions that have been posed. This one by Keith Klein, about to what extent is it countries that are acquiring land versus it is wealthy individuals and companies that are acquiring land in the lower income world. And I think you're absolutely right, Keith. The issue is not so much that it is the US that is acquiring land. It's certainly the case that it is US corporations and individuals in the US that are acquiring land. And the same is true for many of the Chinese investors or many of the investors from Malaysia or from Saudi Arabia. It is not the countries that are acquiring land, yes. But I think to focus only on the individual, so yes, at one level, I completely agree with you that yes, it is not the countries. But I think it is also worth keeping in mind that there are structural reasons why it is US investors or UK investors that are acquiring so much of the land, and not Norwegians or those let's say in Denmark, which are also very wealthy countries. So I think we need to think about both the levels of this issue, which is where do you have the greatest incentives for countries to try to increase their food security or to control the land, which is a central means of production of food supplies. The last question, I think, is a very interesting, but also possibly quite difficult question. And I think this is really the last question that we can take, which is, what are the most important actions you would say are relevant for global food security? And this one comes from Juan Martinez.
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah,
I think.
tough one.
I think at the global level, as I mentioned, I think we need to take a two-pronged approach. One is figuring out ways to increase yield and production in these low-yielding areas from that map that I highlighted earlier. The second is to figure out ways to reduce food loss and waste. And I think particularly this is important at the consumption level. And from an individual perspective, I think the biggest things that we can do is just really think about what you're eating. Think about the environmental impact and the health impacts of the food that you're eating. Is it possible for you, for example, to maybe switch to more plant-based foods? And second, can you think of ways that you might be able to reduce food loss and waste at the household level?
Thank you. Meha, I think we should bring this to a close. I want to thank all our participants for being here and for sticking with us till the end for all your questions. I want particularly to thank you, Meha, for taking time out of your very busy schedule and for being present here to talk with so many participants from all around the world. And I also want to thank both CEVS and the Center for Academic Innovation for organizing this webinar and for bringing us all together and making this opportunity for interactions across geographic, cultural, national boundaries possible for us all. Thank you so much. This is a really important topic, and I'm very glad that we could have this discussion today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone. Amy, a quick question. Will you have a transcript of all the questions and the chat in addition to the transcript that we have created of the conversation?
Yeah, I should be able to get that in the Zoom webinar. So you want me to send it to you?
So I will then disconnect us all today and bring this to a close. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.